Hello, horse racing fans. Let's try and pick a Kentucky Derby winner. I haven't done that yet so far on this show, but I sure as heck have tried, just like many of y'all degenerate horse players have as well. And we will never stop. So let's try for the 2024 Kentucky Derby, also known as the 150th Kentucky Derby. Can you believe that? That something like this can last so long and still get hundreds of thousands of people to all sit in one place and watch the greatest 2 minutes in sports. Man, that's amazing. So let's try and pick the 150th Kentucky Derby winner, starting with number 1, Dornoch. The full brother to last year's Derby winner Mage certainly would be history if he was to win the Derby. However, I do not believe he will. He doesn't exactly resemble his older brother. To the trainer's credit, they have seen if he is capable of other avenues of victory, but so far the only way he's been able to win is by being a frontrunner and leading the whole way. Although he did defeat one of the Derby favorites, Leone, in the Remsen Stakes, since then he hasn't been nearly as impressive, taking down a very weak field in the Fountain of Youth Stakes, and then running rather poorly in the Bluegrass Stakes, where he lost to Leone, effectively redacting the previous win in the Remsen Stakes to some degree. Now, if Dornoch is able to get out of post 1 fast enough, then he could have a chance to steal the whole race and run by himself. However, he's going to first have to break well. If he doesn't, then the race is practically already over for him. But after that, he then has to hope that he can handle the potentially very hot pace. Also, he must mature a bit since his last start, as he is still a relatively green horse who hasn't gotten all his bearings straight. I'd suggest picking another horse because there's better frontrunners in this race, and he's also dealing with the quarter crack. And speaking of which, we got the other side of that Remsen Stakes coin, Leone, who in contrast to Dornoch has only gotten better since his lone defeat in the Remsen Stakes, defeating a loaded field in the Risen Star Stakes in the slop, and then winning the Bluegrass Stakes. In both races, he displayed a similar execution style to his races, coming from behind and then cutting diagonally across, which can be seen as a bad thing, as it indicates that he is still a bit green and needs to learn how to run in a straight line to fully exercise his potential. But although he has a few things to figure out, like most young 3-year-olds going into this Kentucky Derby, he's just such a powerful horse in the way he moves, devouring the ground and destroying many top Kentucky Derby contenders. It's hard not to like a horse like Leone. Besides his general greenness, he will have to deal with the 2 post position, which isn't as much of a problem for him in comparison to Dornoch because he's a come-from-behind horse, but it still does put him very harshly into traffic. But if he is able to get himself out of it early on, then he's going to be coming home late like a freight train. In post 3, we have Mystik Dan. Now, most people will immediately assume that if the race turns up sloppy, go with this horse. That is true, but that's selling him short. Mystik Dan is not only a very good horse in the slop, his other big victory came on a fast track at Churchill Downs, meaning he'll have his bases covered on Derby Day, and not just in the rain, but when it gets fast. He also won those races in different running styles. His maiden victory, he was aggressively towards the lead and then ran away to win by 8 lengths, and then in the Southwest Stakes, he was more mid-pack and snuck up the rail to win in a very dominant way. Before Fierceness, Mystik Dan had the most clear and commanding performance during the road to the Kentucky Derby, and also attributes a lot of the same weaknesses to Fierceness, because he has had a lot of inconsistent performances in between that. Before the Smarty Jones, he tried to go near the lead, but ended up fading late and losing to Catching Freedom. And then in the Arkansas Derby, he had an excusable third-place finish because of a wide and troubled trip, but was still very distantly beat by Muth and Just Steel. So in the same way that on his best day, Mystik Dan could be a real monster, just like Fierceness, there's also the chance that he goes the other direction. And there might be some distance concerns, because he is sired by Golden Sense, who was a sprinter miler. But Golden Sense has sired winners at 1.25 miles before, although that was on the turf, and Mystik Dan's dam side has Colonel John, who won the 1.25 mile Travers Stakes, so he has distance breeding somewhere. He's a very fast horse, but I'd say he's a bit unpredictable. Number 4, Catching Freedom. Very similar and different to Leone in quite a few ways. Both are somewhat green but incredibly talented closers. However, there are some details that separate them. For Catching Freedom, instead of cutting diagonally across, his little green issue is lead legs and maintaining a straight line. As he fidgets with his lead legs, he'll sometimes even hop around in extreme cases, although he started to really correct that issue with the Louisiana Derby, where the only real issue that was left was a delayed lead change in the final eighth of a mile. Besides that, he took himself furthest back of any horse in the field and then went the widest and maintained a generally straight path to victory, closing the final eighth of a mile faster than any other Derby horse in this field with the exclusion of domestic product. In comparison to Sierra Leone, he is faster, however, Sierra Leone did get the edge on him in the Risen Star Stakes. A bit of back and forth between these fast horses. So while Catching Freedom may not have the same level of competition beat as Sierra Leone, he is faster late in the stretch. In post number 5, Catalytic, a horse I thought people were going to talk about a bit more, but I can understand why he hasn't really been mentioned very much. He's been training, he's been working out leading up to his start in the Kentucky Derby, but everyone else seems to be focusing on other horses. In terms of experience, he doesn't really have much. He's ran 3 times, he broke his maiden pretty impressively, then was dead last in his second start and made up a remarkable amount of ground to finish a credible second, and then in his first actual route race, he finished second in the Florida Derby, getting him a spot in the Kentucky Derby, although he was 13.5 lengths behind the winner, Fierceness. Despite how distantly beat he was in that race, he still ran pretty well to pick up the pieces and defeat everybody else. And his loss in his second start at Tampa Bay Downs showed quite a lot of speed and versatility in this inexperienced but talented horse. I could definitely see this horse outrunning his odds and doing something that no one is expecting. And in general, I think this horse is a nice one to look for in the future. He could surprise in the Kentucky Derby, but if it is too early for him, expect a lot from him later. Number 6, the Lucas horse, Just Steel. Lucas is no stranger to having Kentucky Derby longshots do well. 25 years ago, Charismatic won the Kentucky Derby at odds of 31-1. This year, Just Steel is the most experienced horse in the Kentucky Derby field, with 11 career starts, most of those in his youth, where Lucas was trying to figure out what kind of horse he was going to be. But once he was put around 2 turns, Just Steel hit a new gear, being more consistent than ever, with the exception of a clunker in the Rebel Stakes, which was very excusable due to a rough and wide trip. But in 3 of the 4 Kentucky Derby preps held at Oaklawn Park, he has been second and is only getting better, with his second place finish in the Arkansas Derby to Muth being a career best. He has definitely ebbed and flowed through his career quite a bit, but right now, he seems to be putting his best hoof forward going into the Kentucky Derby, and I could see him pulling off a surprise 3rd, 2nd, and maybe even a victory. Keep an eye on this guy. Number 7, Honor Marie, another very lively long shot for some very good reasons. Both of his career victories were at Churchill Downs, so you'll know he'll like the track, and his final eighth of a mile fractions are some of the fastest in this Kentucky Derby field, meaning that he's going to be coming home late to pick up a piece. He is a consistent and strong horse, although he's going to have to worry if the track does turn up sloppy, because that led to one of his weakest performances in the Risen Star Stakes, and Catching Freedom, the horse who defeated him in the Louisiana Derby, has a similar turn of foot, and in some ways can be argued to be an even stronger version of Honor Marie. In the same vein, number 8, Just a Touch. Instead of being a come-from-behind horse, Just a Touch is a bit closer to the pace than Honor Marie, but is just as beloved in terms of longer shot horses. Mainly thanks to a second-place finish in the Bluegrass Stakes, where he was right next to a red-hot pace and still held on very credibly to be second. Which displayed a lot of speed on his end, as all of his speed figures, regardless of where you look from, were incredibly fast from that day. And the only horse who defeated him that day was Sierra Leone, although in comparison to other horses who defeated the Apollo Curse, he doesn't have the same kind of dominance that Justify had, or the same kind of incredible speed that Mage had going into the Florida Derby, instead being more of a strong-willed grinder horse. Still, he's shown a lot of talent in just 3 starts. Scratch number 9 Encino, now we jump to number 10, T.O. Password. This is easily the weakest horse in this year's Kentucky Derby. It's already hard getting a foreign horse to run in the Kentucky Derby that actually looks worthwhile, And in my opinion, TEO Password is one of the weakest offerings Japan has offered in the Triple Crown races, along with Francisco de Ina. He is undefeated and has handled large fields and is 2 for 2 at a mile and an eighth, which is decent, but everything else is a major flaw. The race that got him into the Kentucky Derby, he only barely won by a head bob, and historically, he's as unfavored as they come. Japan's best finish in the Kentucky Derby was 6th, and he's also going to have to deal with 2 separate curses. The Apollo curse, because he did not race as a 3-year-old, and the Leonidas curse, because he's only made 2 starts. You couldn't think of a more improbable horse to win this. So if you want a good Japanese horse to bet, I would stick with Forever Young. As far as foreign horses go, he couldn't look any better. He's undefeated in 5 starts, he's won his races with multiple different running styles, and he's encountered tons of trouble and still won, such as winning the Saudi Derby on the wrong lead leg, and any of his major flaws, such as kickback, are being dealt with methods that his trainer has decided not to reveal, but I assume he knows what he's doing. If there is a year for a Japanese horse to win the Kentucky Derby, I think it really could be this year. If it doesn't happen, then you all can laugh at me because I said the same thing about Derma Sotogake and he finished an alright 6th. But for now, I am going to stick with my hunch and root for the Japanese horse. Number 12, Track Phantom. A winner at Churchill Downs, who briefly was one of the Kentucky Derby favorites with 2 consecutive victories in Derby preps, the Gunrunner Stakes and LeCompte. He was then second in the Risen Star Stakes to Sierra Leone, and then finished 4th in the Louisiana Derby, which is concerning to some because it's been a while since we've seen a horse finish so poorly in their final start and then win the Kentucky Derby. But Track Phantom is still a pretty nice horse with a lot of nice early speed, and also there's going to be a slight change. Actually, a major change. This will be the first time that Track Phantom will be racing with blinkers, and Steve Asmussen seems pretty enthusiastic about this change. So maybe this could be that X factor that pushes Track Phantom from just being a solid frontrunner into a real tough professional athlete. We'll have to see on Derby Day. I'd say that he's a nice horse, but I'm not going to use him personally. West Saratoga, easily the most likable racehorse in this field, a $11,000 bargain, trained by a first-time Derby starter trainer who has been training horses since the 70s. Now that is delightful. But can he win the Kentucky Derby? Well, he's going to need a lot of luck. He's certainly a hard-working horse, finishing in the top 3 in 8 of his 10 career starts, only bettered by Just Steel. And his biggest victory was at Churchill Downs in the Iroquois Stakes. In fact, that makes him the first horse to win Derby points in this year's Road to the Kentucky Derby. So he's certainly a good fighter, at least for 2nd and 3rd, but he seems comparatively slower than the rest of his competition, which is the big worry. But at the very least, he did run a career best in the Jeff Ruby Stakes, so maybe he can push himself just that extra bit further on Derby Day and give us the fairy tale story we would always love to see. And right next to him is ironically the horse who defeated him in his final prep, Endlessly. But the boot is on the other foot this time. Endlessly might be incredibly talented on turf and dirt, but all signs point to saying that this horse does not belong in the Kentucky Derby. Already, historically, only Animal Kingdom has won the Kentucky Derby without a single victory or start on the dirt. That's a pretty tall order to follow. On the other hand, his workouts have been considered so unimpressive that people have universally agreed that he doesn't belong on the surface, simply not taking to the surface as well as you would hope for the Kentucky Derby. Climbing high with his legs, and not grasping the surface the same way he did on the turf or the synthetic. An extraordinarily talented horse, but one that just does not belong in this field. I look forward to seeing what he does in 3-year-old turf races later down the road, but this race is going to be an X on his record. Number 15, Domestic Product. On one hand, historically, an 8-week layoff is very undesirable in the Kentucky Derby, but he does have a lot of speed, although he does require quite a lot of holding back in the early going in order to repress his speed. He is still quite fast, showing incredible final fractions in both of his victories, in his maiden and in his victory in the Tampa Bay Derby. He also is the only horse in this field to have defeated the favorite Fierceness, which is certainly something, even though it was a lesser version of that horse in the Holy Bull Stakes. Although he will have to overcome history, he is a horse with a lot of talent and potential, and has quite a few excuses in a few of his races, including slow paces, rough trips, and generally unfavorable conditions. it's likely that he will appreciate a faster pace than he had in the Tampa Bay Derby, and even then he was still able to make things work and fought hard to win. And technically, he does have the fastest final eighth fraction of any horse in this field, although it was at 1 1/16 by comparison. Number 16, Grand Mo the First, a horse with a propensity for finishing third a lot of the time. And unfortunately, most of that is through just being simply outcompeted. The last time this horse won was when he was a 2-year-old, and it was in a 5.5 furlong sprint. Historically, no horse has won the Kentucky Derby without at least a victory at a race 7 furlongs minimum. He's pretty impressive in some areas, being a horse who has displayed success on all 3 surfaces, dirt, synthetic, and turf, but unfortunately, he's a master of none. Maybe he could pick up the pieces in some way, shape, or form and finish third again. That would actually be kind of hilarious, but that's about it. Number 17, the favorite, Fierceness. For like a few days, people were joking about how this horse would have to do the impossible and win the Derby from post 17, which has never happened historically. But ironically, with the scratch of Encino, that technically is no longer the case, although the saddlecloth number also still applies, but semantics. Anyways, could he win the Derby? Yes. Could he run freakishly well? Yes. Do I think he will? Probably not. This horse seems to be on a real metronome sort of racing pattern. For every spectacular race he runs, he then runs a bad one. He has done this consistently his whole career, broke his maiden stylishly, and then was abysmal in the Champagne Stakes, won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, ran mediocre in the Holy Bull, and then came back and won the Florida Derby by 13.5 lengths without ever being asked whatsoever. I do not enjoy consistent horses, and I am more than willing to bet against him, and if he does win, well, I'll eat my words, but I'm going to stand strongly until the Kentucky Derby and say that this horse is going to bounce in the Kentucky Derby and not run as good or effortlessly as he did in the Florida Derby. Number 18, Stronghold, and this horse is confusing. He has a lot of really desirable qualities as a racehorse. He's never been worse than third in 6 starts. He's won at Churchill Downs, so the whole West Coast stereotype does not apply here. He's a very game horse, winning both the Sunland Derby and the Santa Anita Derby in hard-fought victories. There is a lot to like here. He's a nice, hard-working animal, although you can argue the quality of those races, as both the Sunland Park Derby and the Santa Anita Derby were quite weak. But the amount of character he has, I think, makes up for it. But what surprises me is his odds. Now, obviously, the odds are going to change significantly in the next day and a half. So, I'm not going to name official odds right now, but let's just say that Stronghold has larger odds than West Saratoga and Just Steel, along with Resilience and Domestic Product. Resilience especially is a bit odd considering that Stronghold actually defeated Resilience in his maiden victory at Churchill Downs. Isn't that a little weird? For such a consistent racehorse, whose biggest gripe is just the fact that he won closely against weaker competition, I'm kind of surprised to see his odds so low in comparison to other horses who have even larger flaws. So if you want good money, I think you could definitely get some bang for your buck with Stronghold, especially because the whole market of a horse like West Saratoga and Just Steel is to have large odds. And well, they're currently in around the 30 range, which is still good money, but not as much as I would have hoped for with those horses. So if Stronghold stays floating around the 40-1 range, which for some reason he is, I'd say give it a shot. Number 19, Resilience. Speaking of which, this horse took a while to get going, breaking his maiden in his 4th start, but then when he finally donned the blinkers in the Wood Memorial Stakes, he ran his greatest race by far. Now, the Wood Memorial was definitely a weak Kentucky Derby prep, but Resilience still showed a lot of strength in it. He's improving at just the right time, and with this new equipment change and his jump from a maiden to a Grade 2 winner, maybe he could go one step further and win the Derby under some certain circumstances. He also has a decent amount of speed and closing versatility. He's not just a stalker, he has succeeded from coming from far back. Number 20, Society Man. For the horse's inevitable odds, they're going to be pretty large. I think this horse could be worth dropping $2 on. Now, yes, he did finish second in the aforementioned Weekwood Memorial Stakes, but he also shows a remarkable amount of closing kick. So if the race turns out to be too fast, the race could fall into his lap and he could pull a rich strike. But if he needs to, he can also stalk if needed. In his maiden victory, he was 10 lengths behind the leaders and was able to make up every single piece of it and then win by 3 lengths at the finish. That's a lot of ground to cover and shows a remarkable amount of versatility and tactical speed within a horse that otherwise is quite mediocre. Number 21, the also eligible Epic Ride, who drew in after the scratch of Encino. Encino's scratch is very disappointing to me, because I was definitely going to use him. And Epic Ride is kind of like the substitute version of him, except a lot of what I like about Encino isn't present here. While yes, Epic Ride was able to handle large fields at Turfway Park in a similar way to Encino, he definitely hasn't faced the same amount of trouble as he has. Epic Ride either goes to the lead or stalks in his races and hasn't dealt with nearly as much trouble. Encino nearly won a race after starting in dead last and navigating the whole field, and also won a race going gate to wire. Although Epic Ride did run decently in the Bluegrass Stakes, so he's at least established on the dirt surface, but he hasn't gone through the same kind of character building that Encino had that made me want to use him, so I'm going to personally skip Epic Ride. And lastly, we have Mugatu, who technically is not in the Kentucky Derby as of this recording. However, if a horse scratches before the cutoff time, then he will get in. So I might as well get all my bases covered now. Mugatu is pretty bad. It is commendable that he has run 12 times and is still back ready for more, but despite an impressive run at Gulfstream Park where he was able to navigate a field pretty impressively, it was on the synthetic. His dirt performances have been significantly weaker, and overall, he's just been running really, really bad. Now, if his come-from-behind performance in his lone victory was on the dirt, then I could see a Rich Strike-esque argument, but honestly, I don't see it with this horse. All the same critiques for Epic Ride go to him as well, so Mugatu is, out for me. And with that, that is my brief analysis of every horse that is in this year's Kentucky Derby. Who am I going to use? Well, it's pretty tough. This is a wide-open Kentucky Derby. But so far, I will go with Forever Young, Catching Freedom, Just Steel, and Society Man. The rest will be up to the racing gods. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and make sure to comment down who you're picking in this year's Kentucky Derby. And with that, cheers to 150 consecutive years of the greatest 2 minutes in sports. See you on Saturday.